We've been listening to President Trump and members of his cabinet speak at the 9th cabinet meeting of Trump's administration. It lasted just over 2 hours. We heard the president and Secretary Hegseth discussing a September strike on a boat the administration said was carrying narco-terrorists. Secretary Hegseth saying he did not personally see survivors after the first strike on the boat and that he was not physically present when the boat was struck a second time, though he continued to support that decision. President Trump going even further, warning any country trafficking drugs into the U.S. is subject to attack, including attack on land if needed. Let's bring in our White House correspondent, Monica Alba. It was our own Gabe Gutierrez from NBC News who was trying to really clarify the timeline of that September strike.
Exactly, Christine, and that is what stood out to me as well, because we don't have a lot of information. We did learn a couple new details there, which is the fact that Secretary Hegseth did, as he said a couple of months ago when this happened in an interview, he repeated today that he did, he says, view the strike, the initial strike, in real time as it was unfolding. But then he says, because of his very busy schedule, he claimed that he left at a certain point and that it wasn't for another hour, maybe 2 hours. He couldn't put an exact time frame on it, that there was this order for the second strike that came from, he says, Admiral Bradley. And so we didn't see Secretary Hegseth want to weigh in on that question of what happened maybe in between those two. But he did tell our colleague Gabe Gutierrez that he did not see at that time any survivors, because after that initial strike that you're seeing there, which this is the video that they released at the time and have subsequently released similar videos, it was just, in the words of Secretary Hegseth, something like a fireball. And so he couldn't see whether there were any survivors. But he did continue to defend his commanders generally. He spoke specifically about Admiral Bradley as well, saying that he did the right thing, that this was something where he believes that he was in his right authority to continue to order that second strike. He said he made the, quote, correct decision to sink the boat, but again, that he did not personally see those survivors. What I think is really interesting also, Christine, though, is that it was President Trump himself a couple of days ago who said that he maybe wouldn't have ordered that second strike. And when Gabe asked him about that, he said that, yes, he would like to see some more information, that he would like to learn some more information about that, but that he did trust and does accept Secretary Hegseth's own word on this. And I think the headline and the takeaway, too, on this topic is, of course, now what may happen. And President Trump saying there that he does believe there could be attacks on land, there could be an expansion of this, and that he also was asked by another reporter whether there could be other countries who could face some similar reaction if they are responsible in the eyes of the administration for potentially sending drugs that would come into the United States. And the president did not rule that out, did not take that off the table, saying essentially that any country that does send drugs could potentially be, quote, subject to attack, and that it would not just be Venezuela. So I think that is, in terms of Venezuela and specifically many of the questions we still have, we've learned a little bit more, but there's still now this complete open-ended question about what could come next. And also, Christine, about what could happen to Nicolas Maduro and his regime and his leadership, and the question and the status of that in Venezuela. We know President Trump has confirmed that he did have a conversation with Maduro in the last few days, though he didn't want to reveal too much information about that. So what is next? What has Maduro asked for? And what could be coming in the form of any other U.S. response or action in Venezuela? That's still a really key and open target. That's just one of the major foreign policy issues here that the president's been dealing with. Of course, Christine, there's also the war in Ukraine, which we know that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law and special advisor Jared Kushner are currently in Moscow. They were meeting with President Putin to see if there could be any advancement, any breakthrough on the talks to end the war in Ukraine. The administration has said they feel pretty positively about this, that there could be a big outcome, but we don't have any specifics or details on what these talks have actually yielded. There have certainly been conversations in the past with both Ukraine and Russia that have amounted to some incremental progress, but no actual deal. And that is where we are right now. There is no deal to end this war, but we do know there are very high-level talks ongoing. So that is the other major foreign policy headline, that the president said, look, he hopes that there is something that can come out of this, but that he hadn't been briefed on these discussions yet, of course, because he's been in this lengthy cabinet meeting and because also they were still ongoing as those two officials are in Russia, and we'll see where they go next and where the talks go next.
And quickly, any news that you could glean there on the president's immigration stance? You can see that the press portion of that ended with a very hardline approach from the president, saying that anybody in the country who doesn't like what's happening here should get out. They should get out of the country. We've been following threads about potential travel bans. What are you hearing?
Yeah, and we certainly know that the Trump administration says that it's going to review essentially green card holders in the process, or potentially look at cracking down on some of that process, on some of that type of immigration process and system that's ongoing in the wake of that shooting of the 2 National Guard members, one of whom tragically died and one who is still in critical condition. We've seen Secretary Noem of the Department of Homeland Security recommend a travel ban that she says should apply to, quote, every damn country, that would include people who are potentially filled with any kind of violence or action that they would want to take against people in the United States. Those were the words of Secretary Noem that were then amplified and repeated by President Trump. But again, Christine, there's really a question of how this will work, who it will apply to, which countries, when does it start, and who is going to be overseeing this crackdown or process. We know certainly that they have projected they want to take these additional measures, but we're still waiting on the specifics.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or watch live on our YouTube channel.